Hello, I'm Dickie Arbiter in London.
And I'm Victoria Arbiter in New York, and you're watching Royal Report. The sixth and final season of The Crown begins on Netflix on November 16th. According to reports, it'll cover the death of Diana and the royal family's response to it, and it'll end on a high note with the late Queen's Golden Jubilee and the marriage of King Charles to Queen Camilla. Now, as fans around the world are no doubt eagerly anticipating its return, I suspect members of the royal family are bracing themselves for another round of storylines inspired by the type of gossip and hearsay that has dominated newspaper headlines for decades. It's fair to say the Crown's production values are off the charts, but inevitably it does get a few things wrong. Military uniforms, customs, traditions, protocols, and so on. But it's the plot lines producers purposefully distort that have the potential to cause the most amount of damage. Irresponsible? Preventable? In keeping with dramatic license? Well, that depends on the viewer. But surely when it comes to dramatizing the life of a living or recently deceased individual, producers have a responsibility to get the facts right. Fictionalized dialogue and events are one thing, but altering the essence of a person's character is, in my view, misrepresentation in its purest form. Now, as with any successful television show, there are goodies and there are baddies. And in my view, again, I think it's Prince Philip that perhaps fares the worst. He comes off as obnoxious and arrogant, vain, petulant, a man who really struggles with his wife's position, but that couldn't be further from who Prince Philip actually was. And there are several other notable howlers that serve as a perfect illustration of why The Crown is a TV show and should not be relied on as a documentary. Dad, just a few of these howlers before I toss to you. I think you'll agree that Prince Charles never asked John Major to pressurize the Queen into abdicating. Diana did not forewarn the Queen about her Panorama interview. Michael Fagan did not break into Buckingham Palace in order to discuss his feelings about Margaret Thatcher. Princess Margaret did not urge the Queen to call off Charles and Diana's wedding. There's no evidence to support Lord Mountbatten and the Queen Mother conspired against Charles and Camilla's relationship. Similarly, the Queen did not ban Princess Margaret from marrying Peter Townsend. Papers released by the National Archives in 2004 show that actually she worked out a deal with Anthony Eden, then Prime Minister, that would have allowed her sister to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. Can you imagine if the Crown had actually decided to knock that rumour on the head? But Dad, I think that you will probably agree with me, and I don't want to put words in your head, but among the most egregious storylines, I think, they related to the Queen's response to the Aberfan disaster and the suggestion, I thought it was thoroughly grotesque, that Prince Philip was in some way responsible for the death of his much beloved sister. So I would love to hear your thoughts. I know you have very little time for The Crown, but let's keep it in context of being a TV show, not a documentary, and why it matters about getting these things right.
Okay, I will keep it in context. The Crown, beautifully filmed. I suppose mediocre acting because the characterization left much to be desired. The storyline, I think Peter Morgan had an agenda. He was a Republican. He claims to be a monarchist now. I don't know how you change halfway through, but that's up to him. But at the end of the day, it's entertainment, and you have to look at it only from an entertainment point of view. There's been a lot of angst in the UK, certainly, I don't know about elsewhere in the world, that there's no disclaimer, because this is fiction. You cannot do something like The Crown based on events of the day and then call it fact with the script that's written, because nobody who has been writing the script, even the historical advisor, don't know the words that were being uttered behind closed doors. So you've got to take it from that point of view. Now, I think as far as the Queen and Aberfan, she was a mother. She was a young mother with 2 young children. And what happened in Aberfan would affect any woman who is a mother, and it affected the Queen. Yes, she was criticised quite severely in the media for not going there immediately. Prince Philip did the day after, but the Queen was criticised for not going. Now, one can understand, being a woman, being a mother, all those tragic losses in Aberfan, why there was a certain reluctance, but there wasn't a reluctance for her to go. There was a reluctance because her presence would have interfered with any rescue operation that was taking place. As soon as the head of state, it doesn't matter whether it's the UK or anywhere in the world, everything is cleared, security moves in. And whatever is supposed to be happening there is hampered because the VIP visitor. And that's one of the reasons why it was a week later that the Queen went, that things had settled down at Aberfan. The people who had lost loved ones had come to terms with it, as much as you can come to terms with a loss like that. And the time was right for her at the end of that week to go. She was visibly moved. She did shed tears. There were sort of all sorts of innuendos suggesting that she didn't show grief. My goodness, she did show grief. I remember the pictures coming out. I remember Aberfan very well. But she did have tears. She found it incredibly difficult to talk to parents who had lost children, as any parent would. So to criticise her from that standpoint is very unfair. But at the end of the day, the Crown is the Crown. It is entertainment. Whether Peter Morgan has an agenda, only he can answer that. I can speculate, but I'm not going to speculate. Moving on to your other point, Victoria, about Prince Philip and the loss of his sister. There was suggestion in the Crown, and Crown made it very clear, that she was flying to England to see her brother because he had been denied half-term. Well, firstly, Gordonstoun didn't have half-terms. Half-terms in those days were totally unheard of. It's a sort of late 20th century phenomenon when the teachers need a rest and the children need a bit of a break from punishment and rigorous discipline. She was actually flying to the UK for a family wedding. The plane was flying in dense fog. It hit a chimney in Ostend and everybody on board was killed. He was not blamed by his father. He was not blamed by anybody. She was not flying to see him because he'd been denied half-term. And that is something unfortunate when you play around with the death of a loved one and make it into something that it wasn't. And I think that is very disingenuous of the scriptwriters of The Crown. But there have been a lot of incidents in The Crown where they've just got things terribly, terribly wrong.
Well, and I think let's staying with Prince Philip for a minute, because I was really shocked following his death how many news organizations here in the US relied on the Crown for their information about Prince Philip. Now, I'm not going to name any names, but there was some very high profile anchors here who were using the Crown as a characterization of Prince Philip. So they relied on that arrogant portrayal, that he was obnoxious, that he struggled with his wife's position. But they didn't go into any broader context, and they didn't dig deeper, and they didn't see beyond the facade that the man might show on the outside. I mean, yes, you knew him, obviously, personally. Prince Philip had very little tolerance. That's fair to say. We've seen the video of him using quite prolific swear words when he's irritated with photographers not getting on with the job. But there was so much more to him, as there is with any individual. We are not just one frame captured on video. So I was shocked to see that this footage from the Crown was being used in that capacity. And that's why it matters about these mistakes. And that's why it matters about the disclaimer, because I'm sure so many people are watching, perhaps rolling their eyes going, oh, it's a TV show. It's not supposed to be a documentary. It doesn't promote itself as a documentary. And yet the makers of the show were quite reluctant to put that disclaimer on. I think it was the last season that came out. You had people like John Major and Dame Judi Dench speaking out about the mistakes that are made because they had personally been affected. Now, Dad, I know you are portrayed in The Crown. I think you've got 2 episodes. One of them's called Avalanche and the other one is War. This was in the November 2020 series that came out. Very brave man that took you on, but you had, just a teeny tiny little role. But of course, that's not going to affect you personally. But I think I really feel for the royal family as we come into this final season, because much is going to be made of the King and Queen Camilla's marriage. It did come several years after the death of Diana, and I think public opinion had started to turn and people were in favour of the King finally finding happiness. But unfortunately, what shows like this do is they dredge up all this vitriol and this animosity. And I can't think of another person who continues to pay for the sins that they may have carried out 20, 25, 30 years ago, more than the King and Queen Camilla. And so in that respect, I feel for them. But there's another howler that, again, you have personal experience with, and I wanted to address this one because this resulted in acres of newspaper footage. And this is the infamous Balmoral test. So I'm going to give you a little context and then unleash, Dad, unleash. But it appears in season 4 and it's portrayed as this vital initiation really for outsiders that come to Balmoral. Apparently there's a series of secret tests that they're expected to pass, and then the royal family are going to be nice to you. Now, of course, what the royal family does, perhaps better than any other facility or institution in the world, is hospitality, and they're not by any stretch of the imagination going to be looking for ways to make you feel uncomfortable. But this particular scene, it relates to Margaret Thatcher. They call her the first victim, and the awkward episodes when she goes and she ends up dressing for dinner too early. She struggles to get involved with the royal family's party games, and the general consensus at the end of that episode is that Margaret Thatcher failed and was subsequently subjected to rudeness from the royal family for getting so much wrong. Now, you've been to Balmoral. How did you do?
How did I do? Well, I didn't have a test, that's for a start. And when I went to Balmoral, I'd only been in the job for about 5 weeks, so I was still a comparative outsider. You know, when you join something like Buckingham Palace, as in with any big organisation, there is a probation period, and you come through that probation period and the job is yours. So I was still in the probation period. Balmoral test, it just does not exist. The royal family on entertainment and as hosts par excellence, there is nobody finer in the world at doing it the way that the royals do. And to suggest that they subjected Margaret Thatcher, who incidentally was played by Gillian Anderson, another one of those big question marks characterizations that I mentioned earlier. But anyway, we'll move on from that. It would never have happened because every guest has a valet assigned to them, valet or footman, who will inform them when to present themselves for dinner or for tea, and they will be quite categoric in the information they give, that it is dinner, it is tea, it is lunch, or whatever it is. And if it's a picnic, then you dress accordingly. So the information is there. The information is also printed in your room, so there's no question that you're going to make a howler, you're going to make a big mistake. It just does not happen. And to suggest that that happened to the First Minister, to the Prime Minister, is just absolutely nonsense.
Again, I guess it speaks to the dramatic license, but the problem with The Crown, I suspect, for some people watching it, particularly those overseas who've not grown up watching the royal family in sort of real time, is the fact that the production values, which I mentioned earlier, are so spectacular. The sets, the costumes, the music, the writing, all of it, I think, really creates a whole that makes people think that they can believe this as authentic fact. But I think, like any theatrical production, whether it's television or a book or a movie, dramatic license is there to further the story, to keep audiences captivated. Now, with the royal family, some people might argue that you don't need to add any drama. There's tons of actual drama already there. But Peter Morgan did have to sort of finesse it. And I do think it's interesting that he's said that since writing this show and having a broader understanding of what it is that they do, he has become a monarchist. But I think you can still pick out his favourites. Now, I do want to touch a little bit on, because sometimes we disagree a bit on this, Dad, on the characterizations. And I know that we loved Claire Foy. And I think Claire Foy really did benefit from doing some of the earlier years where, you know, they weren't on the front pages of newspapers in quite the same way. We weren't seeing them in our living rooms in quite the same way. And Claire Foy really sort of had a romanticized version of The Crown to play with. Then we go into Olivia Colman, and I think we'll both agree she's a phenomenal actress. You know, in anything beyond The Crown. I'm getting to that. Give me a second. You know, she can do no wrong. She's brilliant. But I think and you can talk to this in a minute, she's been your sort of least favorite queen for reasons that you'll explain in a second. But before you do, I just want to say that it's not always just on the actor. People are directed a certain way, the writing lends itself a certain way. And Olivia Colman didn't have the benefit of being able to shadow the queen 24/7, 365 days of the year. So again, I think we have to urge the viewers to remember that this is a portrayal, because people, again, believe the portrayal to be an authentic reenactment of who the Queen was. You knew the Queen, so Dad, go to town. You tell people why you think Olivia Colman got it so wrong, but what it was about the Queen that she so sadly missed.
Okay, let me first take, you say sort of characterization, you say direction. If you're an actor starting out in the business, then you're going to listen to every word the director tells you. Director says move over there, you're going to move over there. If you're an actor of renown and have been in the business a long time, you're going to put forward your suggestions. You're going to put forward your characterization. This is how I see the character. I have followed the Queen for the past few days or past few months, and this is how she acts. And you will argue with the director that what he wants or she wants is not the real person. So if you're somebody of stature, you get away with it. Now the media, when I say the media, newspapers invariably reported the Queen at some engagement, late Queen at some engagement, as being rather po-faced. Olivia Colman was po-faced from the beginning to the end. There was no balance, there was no humour. The Queen is fun, she's funny, she smiles, her eyes light up. There was none of that. And that's a great pity. Whereas with Claire Foy, you had a bit of that. You had the young queen. She portrayed a young queen as she was, as I remember her when she came to the throne in 1952. And I was only sort of coming up to 12 years old and went to coronation 13 years old, but enough to be able to judge how a person is and how she is portrayed later in life. We had the same thing with Prince Philip. Prince Philip, yes, he didn't suffer fools gladly. If you had nothing better to say, then you kept quiet and he moved on. You felt as though you're sort of getting the move on attitude from him. But if you had something to say and he contradicted and you proved to him that you were right, he would not say, "Oh yeah, well okay." He'd go, and then he'd move on. But at the end of the day, he would give you the time of day. The way he was portrayed, firstly by Matt Smith, as petulant, sulky, spoilt. That's not the Prince Philip I knew. Then we had Tobias Menzies. Not sure about him. Not sure about Jonathan Pryce either. I think Jonathan Pryce was a little bit better, but then he was a little bit older. We had a slightly older Prince Philip. But Prince Philip, I think one of the things that they did, which was absolute nonsense and absolutely disingenuous, was Prince Philip's alleged sulk because he had to kneel and pay homage to the Queen at her coronation. He was brought up a royal. He was a royal. He knew the rules. He knew what had to be done. And there's no way he would have sulked or done it grudgingly. He would have done it because that was his duty. And he always did his duty. For the 73 years that they were married, he was always there.
I'm so glad you referenced about the Queen being portrayed as po-faced in the media as well, because of course Olivia Colman would have had to rely on a lot of the media coverage, but she was often seen seemingly po-faced, but for a reason, because it would take just one frame of a shutter speed, pictures are going, it just takes one frame of her mid-blink to suddenly then be on the front pages. Queen upset at, Queen angry at, Queen disapproves of, because of course people were interpreting that. So I think her po-face was actually her keeping a rather neutral face, but anyone who met her or interacted with her spoke of those sparkling eyes that you spoke of as well, and her great warmth and sense of humour. So hopefully we will see that come through in this final season. Reports in the Telegraph do say that Peter Morgan is considering a prequel to The Crown. So the royal family has certainly kept his bank account rather full over the years, and perhaps that's why he is now an avowed monarchist We don't know. But for those of you looking forward to the final season of The Crown, I do urge you to watch it as a television show, not as a documentary. Yes, mistakes do matter because they are related to people, most of whom are still living today and don't have any opportunity to answer back or defend themselves. It is a great piece of entertainment, and I think people are going to be enjoying this season because many people were alive for these particular events. But as you do enjoy it, remember, it is not a documentary. We, however, are here to bring you all the facts as we see them. So make sure that you never miss an episode of Royal Report by clicking like, subscribe, ring the bell, and we'll see you next time for another discussion on all things royal.